Here's a quick recap of the steps involved in completing the square, which is the process that we use for turning a quadratic equation from standard form into vertex form, which we are now using in the new unit. Do note that the steps are given, steps 1 through 5 are given in the notes, so it's important to use those notes as you're following through with these steps. And I'll just do 2 examples to show you how this works. As a reminder, we're going to start with step 1 is to divide both sides by the leading coefficient a. Now, in some cases, like in this one, if your a value is 1, you really don't need to do that first step because dividing by 1 isn't going to change anything. So in this case, we're going to skip over that first step, okay? The second step is get all your x's on the same side, okay? So I'm going to kind of show that step right here. That means I'm going to keep my x squared and my 6x on one side, but that means I'm going to have to move this 20 to the other side, and I move it to the other side by doing the opposite. I add it. This is also the place where I say right away, add in blank boxes on both sides, because we are now going to fill in these blank boxes. Okay, so now filling in the blank boxes, that's what this step 3 is. We call this completing the square. To fill in the blank box, we look at the b value. In this case, that's the 6. We divide that by 2, and we square that. So if I take 6 divided by 2, I get 3. If I square that, I get 9. So that 9 is what I'm going to be adding into both of those blank boxes. Okay, now the next step says factor the perfect square trinomial. A perfect square trinomial will always factor into a quantity squared. Now in class, we talked about how this factoring is done. There's a couple of ways you can look at this factoring. One of the first things I tell people is it's always going to be an x. You're going to use the sign of the middle term, so plus, and then you're going to take half of that b value, 3, and then we're squaring that. The other way you can look at it is going back to the factoring that we learned in the last unit. All we're asking ourselves is what 2 numbers multiply to get 9 and add to get 6, and those 2 numbers are 3 and 3. Okay, now on the other side of the equation, we have an addition problem. We're going to add those together to get 29. Okay, at this point, it goes down to next step is just simply solve by taking square roots and rationalize if needed. So that goes back to the very first lesson. How do we solve by taking square roots? That means we're going to take the square root on each side. When we take the square root on the left, that leaves us with x plus 3. On the right, we need to remember when we take the square root to include a plus minus. If the square root of 29 can be simplified, we need to do that. If not, we leave it as the square root of 29. So in this case, 29 is prime. We're going to leave it. And then our final step is to isolate the x. So we will subtract 3 from each side. Now, I always tell people to leave the rational value first. So that's the negative 3. And then plus minus square root 29. And these would be our answers to this type of problem. Now, that one didn't have any tricky fractions, so let's look at one example where you might have some fractions involved. I'm going to skip down to example 7. Again, these are all in our notes. Okay, example 7, step 1. Again, step 1 says divide both sides by a. So we're going to go back over here, and we're going to divide everything in the equation by a. That's going to give us x squared minus 3x, and this nasty fraction, negative 3/4. Equals 0. Okay, now we do the next step. Next step says get all the x's on one side. So right over here, I'm going to leave my x squared and negative 3x on one side. And that means I need to move my 3/4 to the other side. And I'm going to do that by adding 3/4. So it'll become a positive 3/4 on the other side. Okay, this is also the point where I always say right away, add in those boxes. So I'm going to put in a blank box and I'm going to put in a blank box so that I remember to fill those in. Filling in those blank boxes, that's step 3. That's completing the square. And remember, completing the square says take the b value, that's my negative 3, divide it by 2, and square it. Well, when your b value is odd, we're going to leave it as a fraction. So we're going to write negative 3 over 2, and we're going to square that. When we square a fraction, we square the numerator and the denominator. So negative 3 squared is 9, and 2 squared is 4. So I'm going to add 9/4 to both sides. Okay, now step 4. Step 4 is factor that trinomial. Now remember that trinomial will always factor into something squared. Okay, so I know that part. And my shortcuts again, all we're going to do is use the x. We're going to keep the sign of that middle term, and we're going to take half of that middle term. Half of that middle term is 3 over 2. On the other side, we're going to add these together. Since they already have a common denominator, we can add those. 3 plus 9 is 12. Keep the common denominator. And 12 divided by 4 is just 3. So we end up with a nice whole number here. Okay? And then finally, we are down to our last step, which is solve by taking square roots on each side. So I'm going to take the square root, and I'm going to take the square root. Okay, again, on the left, when I take the square root, I'm left with the x minus 3 halves. On the right, I'm going to add in my plus minus. And since 3 cannot be simplified, I'll leave it as square root 3. And then I'll isolate the x by adding 3 halves to both sides. And then once again, I always leave the rational part first. So 3 halves plus minus, and then my square root 3. So these would be my final answers. Now keep in mind these answers are in simplest these answers are in simplest radical form, so I am not actually I'm leaving them as radicals instead of converting them into decimals using the calculator, and I'll show you that in the next video.